The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 28 years old, James had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, following in the footsteps of his grandfather who had stood at the same posts decades earlier. The weight of tradition rested heavily on his shoulders, much like the bearskin hat that crowned his head. James had always taken pride in his unwavering dedication to protocol. Every movement was precise, every gesture calculated, every breath measured. The ancient traditions that governed his role were not mere suggestions, but sacred laws that connected him to centuries of royal service. His fellow guards often joked that James was more machine than man when it came to following regulations, but he wore this reputation as a badge of honor. The palace buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Staff members hurried through corridors with purpose, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of anticipation. Word had spread that Queen Camilla would be conducting an impromptu inspection of the guard posts, something that hadn't occurred in her brief time as queen consort. James felt his stomach tighten with nervousness, but his training kept his expression stoic. As James took his position at the main entrance, he reflected on his journey to this moment. Growing up in a working-class family in Manchester, he had never imagined himself serving royalty. His father worked in a factory. His mother cleaned offices at night, and they had instilled in him the values of hard work and respect for authority. When James enlisted in the military at 18, he saw it as an opportunity to serve his country and perhaps find a sense of purpose that had eluded him in civilian life. The selection process for the Queen's Guard had been grueling. Physical fitness was only part of the equation. Mental discipline, attention to detail, and an unbending commitment to duty were equally important. James remembered the drill sergeant's words during training. "You are not just soldiers here. You are living symbols of the monarchy itself. Every action you take reflects on the crown." Those words had become his personal creed. The first signs of tension appeared when James noticed several senior palace officials engaged in heated discussions near the guard quarters. Their body language suggested disagreement, though their voices remained carefully modulated. James had learned to read these subtle cues during his years of service. Palace politics were complex, and guards were expected to remain neutral observers, never participants. As the afternoon approached, James received word that Queen Camilla's inspection would include a special ceremony. The details were vague, but the message was clear. All protocols must be followed to perfection. James felt confident in his abilities. He had memorized every regulation, practiced every movement until it became second nature, and had never once failed to meet the exacting standards of his position. The other guards seemed more anxious than usual. Corporal Williams, a veteran with 15 years of service, mentioned that changes were coming to the palace. "Things are different now," he said quietly during a brief break. "New reign, new expectations." James nodded, but remained focused on his duties. Change was inevitable, but protocol was eternal. When Queen Camilla appeared in the courtyard, accompanied by her private secretary and a small entourage, James felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded any royal interaction. She moved with confidence, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guards with what appeared to be approval. James maintained his position, eyes forward, breathing steady, embodying the discipline that had been drilled into him. The Queen approached each guard in turn, exchanging brief words with some, simply nodding at others. James could feel her presence drawing closer, and he prepared himself mentally for whatever interaction might follow. He had met her once before, briefly, during a formal ceremony, but this felt different. There was an intensity in the air that he couldn't quite identify. As Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of him, James maintained his rigid posture. She studied him for a moment, her eyes taking in every detail of his uniform, his bearing, his unwavering discipline. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite its measured tone. "Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it?" she asked, though James suspected she already knew his name. "I've heard excellent things about your service record." "Thank you, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "Today marks a new chapter for all of us," Queen Camilla continued, her words carrying weight that James didn't fully understand. "Adaptation is essential for survival, don't you think?" Before James could respond, the Queen's private secretary stepped forward with what appeared to be a formal document. The sight of official paperwork during what should have been a routine inspection sent a chill down James's spine. Something was happening that went beyond normal protocols. "Sergeant," Queen Camilla said, her tone shifting slightly, "I have here new ceremonial guidelines that will modernize certain aspects of palace tradition. These changes will help bridge the gap between ancient customs and contemporary expectations." James listened carefully, though every instinct told him to be wary. Changes to protocol required extensive consultation, training, and formal implementation procedures. Spontaneous modifications were antithetical to everything he had been taught about royal service. The Queen's secretary began reading from the document, outlining various adjustments to guard procedures. Most seemed minor: slight modifications to timing, updated language for certain formal responses, adjustments to positioning during specific ceremonies. James found himself relaxing slightly as these changes appeared reasonable and well-considered. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Finally, the secretary continued, "During formal presentations to Her Majesty, guards will demonstrate respect through the traditional gesture of kneeling on one knee, rather than the current standing salute." The words hit James like a physical blow. Kneeling was not part of guard protocol. In fact, it contradicted fundamental principles of his role. Guards were meant to stand as immovable symbols of strength and vigilance. To kneel was to abandon the very essence of what they represented. James felt the eyes of his fellow guards upon him, though none moved from their positions. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls. Queen Camilla watched him expectantly, clearly waiting for his compliance with what she had presented as a new royal directive. In that moment, James faced the most difficult decision of his military career. His mind raced through years of training, regulations memorized word for word, and the solemn oath he had taken when accepting his position. The protocol was clear. Guards did not kneel during duty, yet here stood the Queen herself, requesting exactly that action. The weight of tradition pressed down upon James as heavily as his ceremonial uniform. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, that centuries of protocol could not be overturned by a single verbal directive in a palace courtyard. But challenging royal authority was equally unthinkable for a loyal servant of the crown. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, James realized that his next action would ripple far beyond this single moment. Whatever he chose to do would be remembered, discussed, and judged by history itself. James felt sweat forming beneath his bearskin hat, despite the cool London air. The silence in the courtyard stretched unbearably as Queen Camilla waited for his compliance with her unprecedented request. Every moment of his training had prepared him for this type of decision, though he had never imagined it would come in such a direct confrontation with royal authority. Drawing upon his deepest reserves of courage, James maintained his rigid stance and spoke clearly. "Your Majesty, with the utmost respect, I cannot comply with that directive. Guard protocol explicitly prohibits kneeling while on ceremonial duty. Such an action would violate my oath of service and contradict centuries of established tradition." The Queen's expression shifted from expectation to surprise, then to something resembling anger. Her private secretary stepped forward quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said sharply, You are being given a direct order by Her Majesty the Queen." "I understand that, sir," James replied, his voice remaining steady despite the chaos erupting in his mind. "However, my primary obligation is to uphold the protocols and traditions that define my role. These cannot be altered without proper consultation, documentation, and formal implementation through established channels." Murmurs began among the assembled palace staff who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a routine inspection. Some appeared shocked by James's defiance, while others watched with barely concealed fascination at the unprecedented drama unfolding before them. Queen Camilla took a step closer to James, her voice dropping to a tone that was simultaneously intimate and threatening. "Sergeant, are you suggesting that your interpretation of protocol supersedes my authority as queen?" This was the moment James had dreaded. The question struck at the heart of everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and service. But deep within him, his grandfather's voice echoed from childhood memories. "A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything, boy. Sometimes doing right means standing alone." "Your Majesty," James said carefully, "my loyalty to the crown is absolute and unwavering. However, that same loyalty compels me to protect the institutions and traditions that give the monarchy its strength and continuity. Guard protocol exists not to challenge royal authority, but to preserve the dignity and stability that the crown represents." The courtyard erupted in whispered conversations as palace staff processed what they were witnessing. Never in recent memory had a guard so directly challenged a royal directive. Some younger staff members appeared excited by the confrontation, while veteran employees looked deeply uncomfortable with the breach of traditional hierarchy. Colonel Harrison, the senior guard commander, emerged from the palace building with hurried steps. His face was grave as he assessed the situation unfolding in his domain. Years of experience had taught him to navigate palace politics carefully, but this situation appeared to offer no easy solutions. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said as he approached, "perhaps we should discuss this matter privately with Her Majesty. I'm sure any concerns about protocol can be addressed through proper channels." Queen Camilla turned to face the colonel, her composure returning but her displeasure evident. "Colonel, your sergeant seems to believe that he has the authority to refuse royal directives based on his personal interpretation of regulations." "Ma'am," the colonel replied diplomatically, "Sergeant Mitchell is one of our most dedicated and knowledgeable guardsmen. If he has concerns about protocol, they deserve careful consideration. Perhaps we could schedule a formal review of the proposed changes?" The suggestion seemed reasonable, but Queen Camilla's response made it clear that she viewed this as a challenge to her authority rather than a procedural disagreement. "This is not a negotiation, Colonel. I have issued a directive, and I expect compliance. Immediately." James watched this exchange with growing unease. He could see the colonel being placed in an impossible position, forced to choose between supporting his subordinates' adherence to protocol and maintaining harmony with the royal family. The personal cost of his stand was becoming clearer by the moment. The tension escalated when the Queen's private secretary produced what appeared to be official documentation. "Sergeant Mitchell," he announced, "you are being formally ordered to demonstrate the new protocol. Failure to comply will result in immediate disciplinary action and potential dismissal from royal service." The threat hung in the air like storm clouds. James felt his career, his purpose, and his identity all balanced on the edge of this single decision. Dismissal from the Queen's Guard would not only end his military service, but would likely make future employment difficult. His reputation would be forever marked by this confrontation. Yet even as these practical considerations swirled through his mind, James found himself thinking about the generations of guards who had stood at these same posts. He thought about his grandfather, who had served with distinction through world wars and social upheaval, never once compromising the sacred trust placed in royal guards. He thought about the young recruits who looked up to him for guidance and example. "Sir," James said, addressing the private secretary while maintaining eye contact with Queen Camilla. "I accept the consequences of my position. However, I cannot and will not violate the fundamental principles of guard service. If dismissal is the result, then so be it." Gasps echoed through the assembled crowd. Several guards shifted slightly in their positions, though their training prevented any dramatic reactions. The younger guards, in particular, seemed affected by their sergeant's willingness to sacrifice everything for principle. Queen Camilla's anger became more visible. "Your stubbornness serves no one, Sergeant. This is precisely the kind of inflexibility that prevents necessary modernization. The monarchy must evolve to remain relevant." "Your Majesty," James replied, choosing his words with extreme care. "Evolution and abandonment are different things. The Guard's unwavering stance represents stability in an uncertain world. To change that symbol fundamentally would be to lose something irreplaceable." Colonel Harrison attempted to mediate again, but the situation had progressed beyond diplomatic solutions. The Queen had made a public demand, and James had publicly refused. Both sides had invested too much to back down without losing face. The standoff continued as word spread throughout the palace. Senior officials began arriving in the courtyard, drawn by reports of the unprecedented confrontation. Some whispered urgently into mobile phones, clearly briefing higher authorities about the developing crisis. Among the arriving officials was Sir Edmund Whitmore, the palace chief of staff, whose reputation for handling delicate situations made him a key figure in resolving conflicts. His presence suggested that the matter had escalated beyond a simple disciplinary issue to become a potential constitutional crisis. Sir Edmund approached the scene with measured steps, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the positions and emotions of all involved parties. He spoke quietly with Colonel Harrison before addressing the situation more broadly. "Your Majesty, Sergeant Mitchell," he said formally, "this matter clearly requires careful consideration of both royal prerogatives and established protocols. Might I suggest a temporary recess to allow for consultation with appropriate authorities?" It was a reasonable proposal, but Queen Camilla seemed disinclined to accept any solution that might appear to validate James's resistance. "This should be a simple matter of following orders, Sir Edmund. The complexity is artificial." James remained at attention throughout these exchanges, his body rigid but his mind racing. He could see paths forward that might preserve both his principles and his career, but they all required compromises that felt like betrayals of his deepest beliefs. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the courtyard and highlighting the surreal nature of the standoff. What had begun as a routine inspection had transformed into a public test of wills between tradition and authority, with James standing as the unlikely focal point of forces much larger than himself. The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point when Sir Edmund Whitmore stepped forward with a leather-bound folder that everyone recognized as containing official palace protocols. His arrival had shifted the dynamic, bringing constitutional authority to what had become a personal confrontation between Queen Camilla and Sergeant Mitchell. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund said with careful deference, "I have consulted the official guard regulations as established by royal warrant. These documents clearly state that ceremonial protocols can only be modified through formal review by the Palace Protocol Committee, with approval from the Privy Council, and implementation through official written orders distributed through the chain of command." Queen Camilla's expression darkened at this intervention. She had clearly expected the matter to be resolved through simple assertion of royal authority, not through bureaucratic procedures that would delay and potentially derail her intended changes. "Sir Edmund," she replied coolly, "are you suggesting that I lack the authority to direct the conduct of my own guards?" "Not at all, ma'am," he responded diplomatically. "However, the established procedures exist to ensure that all changes are properly documented, legally sound, and practically implementable. Sergeant Mitchell's adherence to written protocol is, in fact, Exactly the kind of dedication to established order that makes the Guard so reliable. James felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as this explanation unfolded. While it appeared to vindicate his position, he understood that Queen Camilla's displeasure with him personally had not diminished. The immediate crisis might be resolved, but the larger consequences remained unclear. Colonel Harrison seized upon Sir Edmund's intervention as an opportunity to restore order. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said formally, "you will return to your standard duties while this matter is reviewed through proper channels. Your adherence to established protocol is noted and commendable." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded, but James could feel the weight of countless eyes still upon him. Palace staff members exchanged meaningful glances, and he knew that news of this confrontation would spread throughout the royal household within hours. Queen Camilla departed without another word to James, but her parting glance conveyed clearly that she considered this a temporary setback rather than a final resolution. The private secretary gathered his documents with obvious frustration, while other officials engaged in hushed conversations about the implications of what had just occurred. In the days that followed, James discovered that his stand had created ripples far beyond the palace walls. News of the confrontation leaked to the media, though details were initially scarce and often inaccurate. Some reports portrayed him as a heroic defender of tradition, while others suggested he was an insubordinate soldier who had embarrassed the royal family. The reaction among his fellow guards was mixed, but generally supportive. Younger guards approached him privately to express admiration for his courage, while veterans offered more cautious approval, understanding better the potential long-term consequences of challenging royal authority, even when protocol supported such resistance. Corporal Williams, the veteran guard who had mentioned changes coming to the palace, sought out James during an off-duty moment. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, Sergeant," he said with a wry smile. "But you did what needed doing. Protocol exists for a reason." "I hope I haven't made things more difficult for everyone," James replied, genuinely concerned about the impact on his colleagues. "Change was coming whether you stood up or not," Williams explained. "At least now it'll happen through proper channels instead of royal whims. That's worth something." The formal review process that Sir Edmund had referenced began within a week of the incident. James was called to testify before a panel of senior officials, including representatives from the Palace Protocol Committee, the Guard Command, and constitutional experts. The proceedings were thorough and professional, focusing on the technical aspects of protocol rather than the personal dynamics of the confrontation. During his testimony, James explained his reasoning carefully and completely. He emphasized his loyalty to the crown while outlining why he believed the proposed change would undermine fundamental principles of guard service. His knowledge of regulations and precedents impressed the panel, validating his reputation as one of the most dedicated and informed guards in service. The committee's final report, released 3 weeks after the incident, supported James's position while diplomatically avoiding any direct criticism of Queen Camilla. The report stated that existing protocols had been properly followed and that any modifications to ceremonial procedures would require the full review process that Sir Edmund had outlined. However, the personal cost to James became apparent as weeks turned into months. While he was officially vindicated, his relationship with certain palace officials remained strained. Queen Camilla's displeasure with him had not diminished, and he found himself excluded from certain ceremonial duties and advancement opportunities. Colonel Harrison called James into his office 6 months after the incident. "Sergeant," he said with obvious reluctance, "your service record remains exemplary, and your knowledge of protocol is unmatched. However, the current situation has become untenable for everyone involved." James had expected this conversation, but still felt a pang of disappointment. "I understand, sir. What are my options?" "Transfer to regular Army duties with full honors and excellent recommendations," the colonel replied. or early retirement with full benefits. Either way, your service to the crown will be remembered and respected. The decision was difficult, but ultimately clear. James chose transfer to regular army duties, knowing that his time as a royal guard had ended, but his military career could continue. The transfer process was handled with discretion and respect, avoiding any public suggestion that he was being punished for his principled stand. On his final day at the palace, James stood once more in the courtyard where the confrontation had occurred. The morning sun cast familiar shadows, and everything looked exactly as it had months earlier. Yet something fundamental had changed, both in the palace and in himself. Corporal Williams approached for a final conversation. "Any regrets, Sergeant?" James considered the question carefully. His career as a royal guard was over, his relationship with the royal family was permanently damaged, and his future was uncertain. Yet he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that he couldn't quite explain. "No regrets," he said finally. "I did what I believed was right, and I'd do it again. Sometimes that's all a person can do." The transfer took James to a regular army base, where his experience and knowledge made him a valuable asset in training new recruits. His reputation as the guard who had stood up to royal pressure preceded him, earning him respect from soldiers who admired principled leadership. Years later, when new recruits asked about the incident, James would tell them that following orders was essential to military service, but blind obedience without understanding was dangerous. "Know your regulations," he would say. "Understand why they exist, and when you're convinced that following them is right, have the courage to stand by your convictions." The protocols that James had defended remained unchanged, preserved through his willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for institutional integrity. The Royal Guard continued to stand at their posts, unwavering symbols of stability and tradition, their dignity intact because one sergeant had understood that some things are worth the cost of defending. In the end, James Mitchell had learned that true service sometimes requires saying no, even to those you serve. His stand in that palace courtyard had lasted only minutes, but its consequences echoed through years of military service and became a testament to the power of principled courage in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise.